Do we have any questions from the audience for David, for Phil, for Louise, about anything that's been said, or do you have any reflections from your own work that you'd like to share?
Hello.
Hello.
It's Judy Sepper here.
Hello, Judy. Nice to have you on the call.
Just wanted to say something specific about Mockingbird. Just one moment, because I can't seem to hear myself. Right, just try like that. That's better. Okay, so the Mockingbird system is simple in its principles, which was the point that David was making. But when we reviewed this, we did the work initially with the 3 local authorities to try and persuade them, as they'd expressed interest, in developing this into some kind of bid. This was before the innovation programme was advertised. And I think it's important to say that there are issues about why it hasn't been more widely implemented in the US, which I think is worth, I'm sure that Phil has been trying to find out about that, something I raised with him before. The fact is that by 2007 it started in the first few constellations, and by 2009 I think there were 17 constellations across 3 areas of the US, Washington State, Washington DC and Louisville, but it has never actually spread further. And given the extremely, I think, compelling evidence of its efficacy with respect to foster care retention, placement stability and sibling contact, which are 3 key areas of work, which are 3 key outcomes that people are concerned about, I'm still somewhat surprised that it hasn't spread further. And I think it's worth us trying, all of us that are interested in it, trying to find out more about why it hasn't spread further. Because when I asked the Mockingbird Society that question, they talked about money, but actually there's no question in my mind that this saves money in the long run. The question is whether they maybe require initial investment that for some reason they can't get hold of.
Phil, is there anything that you would like to say about that?
It's a very interesting point, yeah, and it's something that we need to understand more fully if we're going to scale it up across England. I think I don't have any more information really about why it hasn't proliferated any further. I mean, it has been replicated successfully, but yeah, you'd think it would be able to replicate much further than it has. I think possibly it could simply be to do with the capacity of the Mockingbird Society itself in rolling that out, because they do need to provide quite a large level of support, I suppose. And I don't know how much of a kind of expansionist strategy they have in reaching out across the US. They seem to react to demands to replicate it. They've had requests in British Columbia, I think, and I know Japan have contacted them recently as well.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think they do. I think they have internal capacity problems potentially in meeting that demand. I'm not sure.
So that's really interesting. There may end up being 2 different scaling stories around this model in different parts of the world, which will be quite interesting to compare. We have another question come in on the instant messenger from Helen Price, who is asking, scaling or even developing innovation in a highly regulated environment, are there specific challenges and issues? This is something that's, I would have thought, quite pertinent to the sector we're talking about. David, is there anything from your work that you'd reflect on in response to this?
So I'd ask people just to focus back on both the social movement question and the enabling conditions question. What we find in highly regulated environments around the world is that the important thing is the way in which people engage with policymakers and regulators from the beginning. That is, in building their social movements, they're not looking for organisations to be part of that social movement. They're trying to bring in policymakers and regulators in a way that they can begin to understand the barriers that there are to the development and scaling of specific innovations. So there's something about the nature of engagement in this. There's something about the ways in which we can, from the beginning, engage decision makers in working with us and learning with us about the nature of those innovations and what the particular barriers and obstacles are to their development and to their spread. Whereas in situations where people have developed the innovations, often under the radar, and then go to the policymakers, it creates a very adversarial relationship. So can we engage them in a more organic relationship, in being part of this social movement, in a way that they're learning along the way with us what the barriers are and what the obstacles might be. So I think it's a really interesting and important issue, and again needs thinking through from the beginning. But if I may just come back on the other issue that was raised about evidence, and I need to get this right with evaluators on the call. Evidence is really, really, really important. But we know it is not the determining factor in the scaling and spreading of innovation. So if I take the most evidence-based area, which is around drugs, we know that there is a phenomenal difference in the rate of diffusion, the speed at which different drugs diffuse and go into widespread practice. And much research has been done on this. And I go back to my point about demand. Critically, interestingly, one of the major determinants of the rate of diffusion and scaling is how well networked the user or patient communities are. That where patients are well organized, either virtually or in more traditional organizations, we know that drugs that affect those conditions move more quickly. I use this as the example because it's perhaps the most evidence-based areas. And therefore, as well as having great evidence, which is really important, don't get me wrong, we know that the way in which, in order for that to be enacted and become a real motor of change and development, it's not just about professionals and managers that we need to engage, but it's about users that we need to engage in this process.
Really useful, thank you. Thank you, David. We have one other question come in through the instant messenger. This is a specific question for you, Phil, from Rebecca Donnelly, who is asking about engagement with fostering agencies that you talked about when you talked about your engaging, building communities of engagement. And she wants to know whether you can advise, is this equally across both local authorities fostering provisions and independents?
I don't think the split was exactly equal. I think we had slightly more local authorities who came forward interested. Our community of engagement, or the people who will be delivering within our programme, does include an independent fostering provider. We thought it was important to be able to do that since they actually form such an important part of the sector and its future. 30% of children are placed with independent fostering providers, so we thought that was a good decision.
Great, thank you. So we've gone through the instant messenger questions. Has anybody else on the line got a question they'd like to ask of Phil or David? Or has anybody got anything they'd like to share about their experience? So reflecting on what Phil and David have talked about, is there anything you'd like to share about the way that you have thought about scaling at an early stage in developing an innovation? Okay, so I'm going to ask colleagues here again if they have any further questions.
I have a question, actually. It's Louise here again. It's for Phil and David, actually. We've talked today a little bit about is variously called fidelity or sticking to how things should be done, making sure that the model is being done properly and the practice is being done like it was where it originated and where the evidence base comes from. And then we've talked as well about adaptability and making sure things fit their contexts, and we learn and iterate through trying things out in new places. And I just wondered if both of you could reflect on that apparent potential tension in ensuring that the thing itself is actually scaling and not a poor copy that is ineffective, at the same time as ensuring that things aren't just transferred wholesale and imported into new contexts, because I think I've seen both lead to failed scaling in the past.
Mm-hmm. So how do you transfer an idea in a way that makes sense for the place it's going to without losing the thing that really makes it work, which isn't just what might appear on the surface? David, do you want to have a go at that first?
I wish there were a set of rules. That would be really helpful, wouldn't it? But there aren't a set of rules about these things. We do know, as we look across practices that have spread, there are different sorts of models. There are some which require high fidelity to a rather intricate set of protocols and codes. And there are others where it's about fidelity to a set of principles that are really important. And it's pretty hard, and it's one of the ways in which real-time evaluation and building the evidence base as we go along can be really, really helpful in this. Because actually, if we can experiment across a number of areas with the same fundamental practice, we can begin to distill the difference between those elements which are really critical to effective intervention or effective care or effective services, and those which are much more adaptable to local circumstances. But as I say, there is no rule on this, and if you were to think around the world, not just within social care, about practices that spread, you can have very high fidelity models that, as I say, require a sort of second by second adherence to a set of rules, and others where it's the fundamental principles that are at stake. And many of the issues, in some places, the only other thing I'd add to this is sometimes people can be faithful to a practice without being faithful to the principles that underline them. And so I think that, because they often involve mindsets, particularly if it's issues about co-producing services with users, that's not so much following a set of procedures, though that might be important, but it's about an alteration in mindsets. So I don't think there's an easy, straightforward answer, I'm afraid, Louise, but I think there is a tension that needs to be recognised as we get more sophisticated in these practices.
Thank you, David. Is there anything you would reflect on from the work that the planning that you've started trying to do with local authorities around the Mockingbird model, Phil?
Well, I suppose we're lucky with the Mockingbird model in that it is based on a set of principles. So in order to maintain fidelity, they're quite simple criteria that are demanded, such as the hub family having to provide 2 free placement opportunities for respite care. And yeah, so they're quite simple principles, and within the framework that it does allow for local adaptation to an extent, because you need to look at how local protocol will change and how the model can fit in with local policies and the context. So we have that really already from the US. One thing we did think could require some additional adaptation is that although the Mockingbird Society say that the differences in the places they've replicated the model are quite significant in the US, and probably the UK would be no more different than the variation they've had within the US. I don't think they've come across the issue of delivering within an inner city. We have 2 local authorities in London boroughs, and for a hub carer to be able to have 2 free placements within their home, that could be challenging. So we're looking with the Mockingbird Society at how those hubs could work without 2 placements. whether they would work in tandem to support a constellation of carers. So that, I think that'll be one of our learning points about the adaptation, is how we can make it work in inner city environments.
So Phil, can I just give people impression? You're looking at a mixture of types of location across the UK, aren't you? Can you say a bit more about the range that you have and the if you can name locations, fine. If you can't, just a description.
I can, yes. So the original cohort of people who were interested came from the Yorkshire Recruitment Consortium that Judy Seb had been working with, as she mentioned. So we have Leeds and Calderdale from that area. Our connections with the North West Regional Consortium through our practice development team as well. We managed to get the relationship going with Stockport Council, so we have a kind of gateway into the North West. It's quite widespread, actually. Our independent fostering providers based in Kent. We have 2 London boroughs, Oxfordshire and Doncaster.
Great, thank you. So that's going to be incredibly interesting and challenging. Are there any more questions? This is my last call out to the audience for questions.
Hello.
Hello. Yes.
Hello, I'm Michelle Whiting. I'm calling from Barnsley. I was very interested to hear about the Mockingbird model, because whilst our bid was about direct work with adolescents, it was very much based around the notion of mentoring, and we've actually sort of called it finding the sort of sage, because one of the things that we've noticed that adolescents that tend to survive and do well are those that have either got somebody within their family unit who can support them, or we can find somebody within the extended family. So we're really trying to build on that kind of model of finding somebody who can offer long-term support to that young person beyond that which services can offer, because, as we know, social workers come and go. And thinking about that. And the other element of our model is really thinking about how we enable young people to inform the build of the model and how it looks and how it's delivered, which seems to. So I think what David was saying about having that those pathways of participants really resonated with what we're trying to achieve in terms of really trying to work with young people and co-produce a model that looks very different to the kind of imposed professional models that we've maybe had in the past. So I think it sounds like there could be some real cross-learning between the two kind of approaches in two different spheres of the same issue.
Great, thank you very much for sharing that.